Have you ever had a horrible sinking feeling where you think, this is not supposed to happen? That's exactly what happened to the crew of an Airbus A320 over the south coast of France in 2008. Not only was their state-of-the-art plane not behaving as it was supposed to, but its software, which was supposed to help the pilots, was now actively trying to kill them. Second by second, they wrestled with their plane, as it seemed to have developed a mind of its own, hellbent on bringing them crashing down into the Mediterranean Sea. Would the pilots be able to save their stricken aircraft? Or was their demise inevitable? And more importantly, what got them into this situation to begin with? This is the story of XL Airways Flight 888 Tango. November 27th, 2008 started off as a cold, cloudy day in Perpignan on the south coast of France. At the airport, two pilots were preparing for a flight. But this was no ordinary flight. Its purpose was not to carry passengers from A to B. Indeed, the flight had no regular passengers. Rather, Flight 888 Tango was what's known as an acceptance flight. The plan was to go out over the Bay of Biscay and do some tests, and then to fly back towards Perpignan, but rather than landing there, the pilots would simply do a go-round and proceed directly to Frankfurt. The reason that this flight was happening in the first place is that Air New Zealand had leased the plane to XL Airways, a charter company based in Germany, a number of years ago. And now that that lease was up, Air New Zealand wanted to see that the plane still had a clean bill of health. So, while it was called an acceptance flight, the acceptance of the plane was conditional on it being able to perform a series of flight maneuvers and procedures to ensure that it was operating without any issues. As such, it was really more of a test flight than anything else. This didn't just involve checks in the air. In order to ensure that the plane was fully serviceable, before the flight, 3 Air New Zealand engineers had spent 3 weeks meticulously going over the aircraft on the ground. Among other things, this involved checking that there was no damage due to such events as a heavy landing or any other issues that had rendered the Airbus in a worse state than when it had arrived in Germany at the start of the leasing period. In preparation for its transfer back to Air New Zealand, the aircraft, which had been in the XL paint scheme during the lease, had also now been repainted into the Air New Zealand colours. This flight would be the final test after a long list of checks before the plane re-entered service with Air New Zealand. For the pilots, this flight was something to look forward to. They would get to push the plane to its limits in a way that they just couldn't do on a normal passenger flight. In command of the flight was 51-year-old Captain Norbert Kappel. Kappel had been with XL Airways Germany since February 2006 and had logged more than 12,000 total flying hours, including just over 7,000 on the Airbus A320. He was quite senior at the airline. As well as being a type rating instructor teaching pilots to fly the A320, he was also a type rating examiner, deciding whether they should get their licenses. And he was the head of air and ground operations at the airline. Joining Kappel in the flight deck was 58-year-old First Officer Theodor Ketzer. Ketzer had been with the airline since April 2006. He was also very experienced, with just under 12,000 total flying hours, about half of which on the Airbus A320. Sitting behind the two men was a third pilot. He was 52-year-old New Zealander Brian Horrell. Horrell had been with Air New Zealand since September 1986. On this afternoon, his role was to monitor the flight and to provide information to the crew as to what needed to be checked. He had been an Airbus A320 captain since 2004 and had more total experience than either of the other crew, with about 15,000 flying hours, but less on the A320, just north of 2,000 hours. Like the captain, he was a type rating instructor and examiner. Once this flight was done, he would fly the aircraft back to New Zealand. In the cabin were the 3 Air New Zealand engineers who had carried out the previous ground examination of the aircraft systems, fuselage and engines. The engineers were 37-year-old Murray White, 49-year-old Michael Giles, and 35-year-old Noel Marsh. Even though their presence on the acceptance flight wasn't needed, they had boarded to save time, Once the tests were completed, the plane wouldn't even need to land at Perpignan to pick them up. It could just fly back over the airport and head straight to Frankfurt. The final individual on board was a member of the New Zealand Civil Aviation Authority. 58-year-old Jeremy Cook was overseeing the inspection. The test portion of the flight was expected to take just over 2.5 hours. All was well as the pilots completed their final checks and got the plane ready for departure. The flight had been delayed on the ground for 2 hours, and now, finally, at 3:30 in the afternoon, it had received clearance to push back. The pilots started the engines, and Flight 888 Tango began taxiing out to runway 33 at Perpignan. The captain would be flying the aircraft on this afternoon, with the first officer acting as pilot monitoring. At 3:45 that afternoon, the captain lined up on runway 33 and began the takeoff roll. The takeoff was normal, and within a few moments, Flight 888 Tango was climbing nicely into the skies above France. 2.5 hours might seem like a long time, but given how many tests the pilots had to carry out, it really wasn't. They would need to use every minute available to them to get the checks done. In fact, the very first test began just moments after takeoff. Rather than raising the gear when they first got airborne, the pilots instead brought up the wheel page on their central display. They were going to time how long it took the gear to raise. The first officer pulled the gear lever up, and the crew started a timer. In all, it took 14 seconds for the gear to come up, well within the normal range. The first of many checks was done. The pilots would carry out many similarly tame checks as the flight progressed, but some of them would be quite a bit more exciting, and although they didn't know it yet, their aircraft was hiding a critical weakness, one which would come to surprise them at the worst possible moment. About 1 minute after takeoff, the captain engaged the autopilot. The flight was cleared to climb to flight level 190, about 19,000 feet. As the plane climbed higher, the French ATC sector controller contacted the Perpignan approach controller by phone. He wanted to confirm that the flight crew had been fully authorized to perform the acceptance flight. However, he did not refer to it as an acceptance flight, but a disguised test flight. This was a pretty accurate description, and it was informed by the controller's experience with another XL Airways Germany aircraft earlier that morning. 5 hours before Flight 888 Tango, another XL Airways Germany flight had filed a virtually identical flight plan. That crew had contacted the radar controller and requested several times to perform maneuvers. This had increased the controller's workload considerably, as it required coordination on several occasions between different control sectors. The usual procedure when carrying out an air test like this is that the aircraft would be positioned in an area removed from the numerous airways crisscrossing Europe, which are basically the motorways of the sky. Once the aircraft is sufficiently clear of those airways, it would be standard practice to ask air traffic control for a box. Within this box, the aircraft could then do the required tests, safe in the knowledge that there would not be any other aircraft allowed within that area. But after their taxiing experience of the test flight earlier that morning, the controllers weren't keen on letting another plane carry out a similarly imposing series of maneuvers. So, just minutes after takeoff, when the captain asked to perform a 360-degree turn, the controller denied this request. In fact, he told the flight crew that they did not have permission to carry out any maneuvers within the general air traffic flow. What this meant for the crew was clear. They would now have to improvise. They needed to get all of the tests done, but rather than carrying them out in the systematic fashion which they had planned, they would need to fit different tests in as the opportunity arose. With the controller having made his position clear, the captain then confirmed that they wanted to continue on the planned route as detailed in the flight plan for now, but that they would be returning to the airport not in 2.5 hours, as planned, but in about 20 minutes. The controller acknowledged this, and a few moments later, cleared the flight to climb to flight level 320. At this point, the pilots were in an unfortunate position. There was no point heading all the way out to the Bay of Biscay for 2 hours if they weren't going to be allowed to perform their manoeuvres there. So, with that restriction in mind, the captain suggested to the Air New Zealand pilot monitoring the flight that, in order to ensure that the required checks were completed, the check on the flight controls could be delayed until the approach. The Air New Zealand pilot agreed. In the meantime, the crew could continue with the many other tests they still had to carry out. They had been cleared to a waypoint called Manak and began heading in that direction. One check was to see if both transponders were working. The first officer switched the transponder system from 1 to 2, and then the captain pressed the ident button so that the plane's target would flash on the controller's screen. The first officer asked the controller if they still had the plane on radar, and he confirmed that he did. So transponder system number 2 was working. The captain switched back to number 1 as he was flying, and on they went to the next test. The pilots checked that the fuel was distributed symmetrically in the aircraft's tanks, and that their primary flight displays all showed the same amount of bank, that is, 0 degrees, when the plane was flying straight and level. There were many more tests like this, like tuning in radio beacons on the various navigation radios, turning off the auto thrust and checking that the plane's manual thrust worked properly, and so on. The Air New Zealand pilot was telling the captain which tests needed to be done, and the captain was carrying them out. After a few minutes, they got to some of the more interesting tests. Tests which will allow us to look at some of the key reasons behind the serious problems they would encounter on the way back to Perpignan. The Airbus A320 is famously a fly-by-wire aircraft. What that means is that when the pilots make a movement on the side stick, there is no direct mechanical connection to the control surfaces on the wings and tail, like there is on a traditional aircraft. Rather, every input the pilot makes on the controls is sent to a series of computers, which make sure that the control inputs the pilot has made keep the plane within safe limits. Once these computer checks are complete, and they only take thousands of a second, the control signals are sent not by cable and pulley, but by electrical wire to the control surfaces on the wings and tail. The introduction of this technology to passenger aircraft has allowed Airbus to give their aircraft some unique features, which up until this point had simply not been possible. Now, the pilots were about to test some of these features. The first officer told air traffic control that they would now be making a right-hand turn to a waypoint called Gaillac. With that, the captain disengaged the autopilot and began banking the plane to the right. But he didn't stop the bank at the usual 20 degrees or so. Rather, he kept on going, steepening it until it went to 33 degrees. Then, as per the Air New Zealand pilot's instructions, he let go of the stick. Just as Airbus had ordained, the A320 held that bank angle and maintained altitude perfectly. A traditional aircraft at this point would start to pitch down, and its bank angle would not stay where it had been set, slave as it would be to the laws of aerodynamics. But the A320's computers were working hard to keep the plane exactly where the pilots put it. But the Airbus magic doesn't stop there. For the next part of the test, the captain rolled the aircraft further, past 45 and even as far as 50 degrees. This was a very steep angle, which would basically never be needed in normal commercial operations. For this reason, Airbus built in a protection. This time, when the captain released the side stick, the aircraft automatically returned to 33 degrees angle of bank. The Air New Zealand pilot could now check another item off his list. The Airbus could do all of this because it was operating in something known as normal law. This is the automation mode in which all of the Airbus's computerized protections are in force. But there's more to these protections than just limits on how far pilots can roll the plane. There are also high-speed protections and low-speed protections, which prevent pilots from flying so fast that the plane risks breaking apart, or so slow that it stalls. In order to fully test the plane, the pilots would need to see how it behaved in a paired back state of automation known as alternate law. In alternate law, the aircraft will operate very similarly to Boeing 737 or any other conventional aircraft. It will still handle normally, but without the overspeed and stall protections. Pilots know they're in alternate law because they'll see a specific message on their central display saying as much. They will also see on their primary flight display that what had previously been a set of green dashes has turned into amber X's. The pilots would see this in a moment, but first they had one more test to complete before starting their descent. They received permission to climb to the A320's maximum operating altitude, flight level 390. Once there, they started the APU, the auxiliary power unit, a jet engine in the back of the plane that provides electrical power without producing any thrust. Once they confirmed that it started up within the correct time frame and ran normally once it did, they were finally ready to head back towards Perpignan and complete the last of their checks. At 5 minutes past 4 that afternoon, the pilots of Flight 888 Tango turned towards Perpignan and began a descent to flight level 310. On the way down, they checked that the plane's overspeed warning worked correctly. The captain disconnected the autopilot and autothrust, pitched the nose down, and allowed the speed to build up to the point that it entered what is known as the barber's pole. Once this check was completed to the Air New Zealand pilot's satisfaction, the captain resumed a normal descent, while the first officer negotiated the clearance with air traffic control. This had turned out to be a much more rushed flight than the crew had hoped for, but they seemed to be getting most things done. However, a nasty surprise was now in store for them. One of the final checks that did need to be completed before the aircraft did a go-round and flew onwards towards Frankfurt was to test its low-speed protections. Flying slowly is one of the most dangerous things that can be done on a plane. The reason for this is that planes only fly in the first place when the air is moving fast enough over their wings. Without forward speed, a plane just becomes a heavy chunk of metal and falls from the sky accordingly. To prevent pilots from getting into low-speed situations, Airbus have programmed a number of safeguards into the fly-by-wire software of the A320. One quite straightforward limit is shown by the top of the amber part of the speed tape here. This is known as VLS, or Velocity Lowest Selectable. As the name suggests, this is the lowest speed that the autothrust will maintain. Even if a pilot selects a lower speed on their panel here, the autothrust will still keep the plane at VLS without going any slower. Importantly, VLS is not the stall speed, but a speed with a margin above the stall speed. But the Airbus has a further level of protection than just this, as a last resort to prevent a stall. And in a few short moments, the pilots were going to test this. The crew is now cleared to descend to flight level 80. As they descended through about 18,000 feet at a speed of 300 knots, the Air New Zealand pilot asked the crew if they were ready to put the plane into alternate law and check that this worked normally. Again, he reminded them that due to some of the fly-by-wire protections being lost, for safety, these checks must be performed above flight level 140. Despite this requirement, as he was already descending, the captain decided to perform these checks not at flight level 140, but 2,000 feet below this altitude. There was no need to rush to do these checks. They could be done on the way back to Frankfurt at a safe altitude. But nonetheless, the Air New Zealand pilot didn't stop the captain from performing them. This lapse in procedures was the first of a few that would unfold over the next few minutes. The captain turned the autopilot off, and then the Air New Zealand pilot turned off two of the plane's computers, FAC1 and FAC2. The plane was now in alternate law, as shown by the two amber crosses here, and the notification on their central display. The captain made minor movements on each of the plane's axes, checking that the elevators control the pitch properly, the ailerons control the roll, and that the rudder worked normally. This check was now complete. The crew turned FAC1 and 2 back on, and the captain re-engaged the autopilot. Now, the A320 was back in normal law, ready for its final test. Air traffic control told the flight to turn left heading east and to slow to 180 knots. They were being set up for an approach to runway 33 at Perpignan. As the crew descended and slowed down, the Air New Zealand pilot described the next test. He needed to see that the aircraft's protections kicked in correctly when it was flying slowly. He briefly ran through the requirements for this check. The aircraft needed to have its flaps fully extended and its landing gear down. But this time, he left out the bit which said that they had to be flying at least at 14,000 feet. The captain asked if, for this test, he needed to go all the way down past VLS into the next stage, known as alpha prot. Alpha is the angle between the oncoming airflow and the wing, also known as the angle of attack. Alpha protection is an Airbus software feature, which, as the name suggests, protects the aircraft from reaching excessive angles of attack. In a conventional aircraft like the 737, it's possible for the pilots to stall the plane by simply pulling back far enough that the angle of attack gets so high that the wing stalls. In an Airbus, even if the pilots hold the side stick fully back, the plane will not stall, because its computers will lower the nose, keeping it right at the edge of a stall, but not allowing it to go any further. For this test to be ticked off the list, the pilots did indeed need to go into alpha prot, as indicated by the part of the speed tape below VLS. In fact, they needed to go even further than that, into what's known as alpha floor. Alpha floor is the computer's last-ditch effort to prevent the A320 from stalling. No matter where the thrust levers are, it brings the engines to full thrust, helping prevent the plane from losing any further speed, thereby avoiding a stall. The Air New Zealand pilot reminded the captain that in order to activate this mode, when he reached VLS, he would need to pull quite hard on his side stick, something that would feel quite counterintuitive to any pilot. The captain said that he was fully aware that this was the case. The Air New Zealand pilot then described how the captain would need to get the plane back into a normal condition after this happened. Once alpha floor had kicked in and the plane had started climbing, he would need to pitch forward and then disconnect the autothrust. So, now everyone in the cockpit was on the same page about how to carry out this test. Soon, the approach controller cleared the crew to descend further to 5,000 feet and told them to turn right onto a southerly heading. They were being set up for an ILS approach to runway 33 at Perpignan. The captain, seeing that they were now quite close to landing and consequently quite low over the water, said that they would probably have to do the slow flight test later, perhaps on the way to Frankfurt. The Air New Zealand pilot agreed. After all, when student pilots first learn how to fly, they are taught an acronym which they must run through before practicing any stalls. HASL, or HASL as I used to think it was called. The very first letter of this acronym stands for the most important issue to check, and that is height. Before carrying out any maneuvers which could result in a loss of altitude, pilots must ensure that there is enough height to recover. Earlier in the flight, as they were climbing to flight level 390, the Air New Zealand pilot had highlighted the fact that any check on the aircraft's low-speed protections must be carried out above flight level 140 and not on the approach. But soon, both he and the captain would let this vital safeguard slide. Once they had levelled off at 5,000 feet and their speed had come back to 180 knots, the controller cleared the crew to descend further to 2,000 feet. The captain then said, "Down below the clouds, so you want what?" "To go slower, you mean?" asked the New Zealand captain. The captain and the co-pilot responded affirmatively. In other words, all three crew members were now agreed that they would get down below the clouds and begin the low-speed check. This went against the explicit instructions for this flight, and also against common sense. Nonetheless, at 43 minutes past 4, the captain moved the thrust levers to idle and began a descent through the clouds. He called for landing gear extension, and the first officer lowered the gear. Now, out from the bottom of the clouds, and nearing 3,000 feet, the captain asked for one final confirmation. "We do the low speed, yeah." The two pilots were now sharing responsibility for their poor decision to carry out these checks well below a safe altitude. Meanwhile, the controller still wasn't quite sure what the crew's plan was. She asked twice before getting an answer from the first officer. the flight would be carrying out a go-round, and then it would fly to Frankfurt. The captain asked the Air New Zealand pilot if there were any speeds he should bring the aircraft to as part of this test. The Air New Zealand pilot said no. He could go all the way back until he reached Alpha Floor, the final protection. The pilots had no reason to doubt that the Airbus would behave exactly as it was supposed to. It was a normal law, after all, which meant that it would be impossible to stall. So really, they could do this test even lower to the ground, and they would still be safe. The reliability of the Airbus's protections had emboldened them, in a way that, ironically, might not have been the case in a more straightforward aircraft. But these flights are risky for a reason, and now the crew were about to see why. The captain levelled the airplane at an altitude of 3,000 feet. Its gear was down and its flaps were fully extended. The flight directors were engaged, and their guidance appeared on the captain's main display as this green cross here. As long as he kept the aircraft simple here, on top of the flight directors, he would stay level at 3,000 feet. With the thrust levers at idle, the plane began to decelerate. And as it started to slow, it pitched further and further up to maintain altitude. As the speed decayed further, the captain held the stick back slightly to help keep the nose up. To achieve this gradual increase in pitch, the computers controlling the horizontal stabilizer in the plane's tail told it to gradually tilt further and further forwards. This movement was visible in the cockpit on the trim wheel here. In an Airbus, the trim is automatic, and pilots never have to use this wheel unless they're in certain types of emergency. By looking at the numerical markings here, pilots can see how the horizontal stabilizer is angled at any given time. The horizontal stabilizer is a massive surface, and as such, it's very powerful. Much more powerful than the elevators here, which the pilots control with the side stick. Over a period of about 30 seconds, as the plane slowed, the horizontal stabilizer moved from a position of 4.4 degrees down to its electric stop of 11.2 degrees down. Now, it had nothing left to give. By this point, the plane had slowed below VLS, and the captain had to pull back on his side stick to maintain altitude. Before long, the plane was flying very slowly, at just 99 knots, slower than the cruising speed of a light training aircraft. This was all part of the test, and so far, everything was as expected. But what happened next was not. Contrary to what was supposed to happen in normal law, the plane didn't automatically go into alpha floor, with the automation applying full thrust on the engines. Instead, the speed dropped to the point that the stall warning sounded. Alpha floor never kicked in. Recognizing this, the captain immediately did the computer's job himself, slamming the thrust levers to their highest setting. The engine spooled up and the plane pitched up and rolled to the left. The captain tried to counter this roll, but with the plane travelling so slowly through the air, its flight control surfaces simply weren't that effective. The speed continued to decay, and the captain kept holding his side stick forward and to the right. This was not at all what he'd been expecting. Something was going badly wrong. Not knowing what to make of the situation, both the flight directors and the autothrust disengaged. But the engines stayed at maximum power, as this is where the captain had put them. The plane now began rolling quickly to the right, reaching as far as 50 degrees of bank, before the captain used both his side stick and his rudder pedals to wrestle it back. Finding itself in a completely bizarre situation, the plane went from normal law straight down to direct law. Now the computers had handed full control to the captain. There were no more safeguards, no more limits on pitch or roll, and no more low-speed protections. And most importantly of all, the automatic trimming function had been lost. The pilots now had to control the powerful horizontal stabilizer themselves. To alert them to this fact, their central displays showed the words, "Use manual pitch trim." But in the heat of the moment, this wasn't exactly the easiest thing for them to see. The captain now had his hands full with an aircraft which suddenly appeared to have developed a mind of its own. the fact that the pitch trim was under their control wouldn't have been too big of a deal were it not for the fact that the pilots had been testing out how the aircraft behaved in slow flight, which had necessitated the stabilizer to move to its fully nose-up position. And now that the plane was in direct law, this is where the stabilizer would stay, unless the pilots moved it. Still not seeing this, the captain tried his best to push the nose down, as it rose higher and higher. But his efforts were useless. The elevator, which his side stick controlled, just wasn't a big enough surface to present to the airflow to overcome the much bigger stabilizer. To make matters worse, the powerful thrust from the engines, being below the aircraft's centre of gravity, caused the nose to swing up even further. The captain tried desperately to pitch the nose down, pushing his side stick to its forward stop. But the nose kept rising, going past 30, 40, and even 50 degrees above the horizon. Pointed skywards, the plane climbed rapidly, its rate of climb exceeding 5,000 feet per minute. But as it went uphill, its airspeed dropped sharply. If the pilots were going to have any chance of saving the plane, they needed to realize that the stabilizer was in the fully nose-up position. Flight 888 Tango reached the peak of its terrifying climb just shy of 4,000 feet. All of its airspeed had bled off. It was completely stalled, nothing more than a hunk of metal in the sky. Now, simple gravity played its role. Still pitching up, although less so than before, the plane entered a rapid descent. The stall warning sounded continuously, and in a matter of seconds, the aircraft had lost 1,000 feet in altitude. The captain, still in shock, fumbled with the controls, pulling back, pushing forwards, and trying desperately to level the wings as the plane swayed like a falling leaf. These control inputs were no good. They were too sporadic, too temporary, and, in any case, too little now that the aircraft had stalled. Flight 888 Tango kept falling. Soon, the aircraft banked violently to the right, and the nose dropped well below the horizon. The sight of the Mediterranean Sea filled the pilot's windscreens as the plane screamed downwards even faster. Seeing how close he was to the sea, the captain hauled back on his side stick. He finally had enough airspeed to fly, but there just wasn't enough space to recover. In a desperate attempt to prevent the inevitable, the captain pulled the thrust levers back towards idle, and then, frantically, pushed them forward again. But there was no space left to recover. At 4:45 that evening, Flight 888 Tango smashed into the sea, just off the coast of Perpignan. Nobody on board survived. This accident came as a shock to the industry. While it was clear that the pilots had carried out this part of the check way too low to the ground, the fact was that they would still have gone out of control and stalled, even if they had carried it out at the right altitude. The big mystery, therefore, was why the plane had dropped out of normal law, freezing the horizontal stabilizer in its last position. Was there something wrong with the plane's built-in protections? And if there was, were other Airbus aircraft at risk? With the A320 carrying hundreds of millions of passengers every year, this was a terrifying prospect. The answer to this mystery lay deep within the plane's angle of attack sensors. The Airbus A320 is fitted with 3 angle of attack sensors. You can actually see these anytime you board the plane. They measure the angle between the wing and the oncoming airflow, and feed this data into the aircraft's computers. At some point during the flight, 2 of these sensors stopped moving. Strangely, they both became stuck at almost exactly the same time, as the plane was level in the cruise. What this meant was that they were stuck at the same angle, one which, because the plane was in cruise flight at the time, was well below the stall angle of attack. So, what could have frozen these sensors? Ice is always a threat to these instruments, attached as they are to the outside of the aircraft. But for that reason, they're electrically heated. And, given that these heaters were working, something else had to be the cause. To answer that question, we need to go back to when the aircraft first arrived at Perpignan Airport on the 3rd of November 2008 for maintenance and painting work. As it happened, when the XL Airways livery had been sanded off, much of the aircraft was covered in paint dust. According to requirements, this dust could only be removed using clean, dry, white cloths. Despite that requirement, EAS Industries, which carried out the job, decided that this would take too long to complete. So, much like the pilots would do later on, they decided that they would break from procedures and take a shortcut. Instead of rubbing the aircraft down with cloth, they used a fire hose connected to the general water supply to spray the plane clean. And during this spraying, using high pressure water, they didn't put covers over the angle of attack sensors. Due to the extreme pressure of the hose, water infiltrated both sensor systems, getting deep inside. Days later, as the plane cruised at high altitude where temperatures were far below freezing, this water, which had remained there all this time, froze. When it did, the angle of attack vanes themselves became locked in place. But how exactly could the failure of these two sensors have caused the plane to crash? These sensors sent a constant stream of data to the aircraft's computers, telling it what angle it's making with the oncoming air. As the pilots began the low-speed check, the plane pitched up, and the angle of attack increased, just as planned. But because the angle of attack vanes, which normally weather vane with the oncoming air, were frozen in place, the aircraft was under the impression that the plane was pretty much flying straight and level, like it had been when the sensors froze. There was a third angle of attack sensor, which worked perfectly. But, in an awful twist, because the two wrong sensors agreed with each other, the plane's computers took those to be the reliable ones, and ignored the data from the one good sensor. So, even as the plane pitched up and slowed even further, the computers had no way of knowing that it was approaching an angle where the wings would stall. The result of this was that the plane got all the way to the stall warning without any protections ever activating. The stall warning is never meant to happen in normal law, because the aircraft is never meant to approach a stall in the first place while in normal law. So, once this warning sounded, the aircraft knew that something must have gone wrong. So, it dropped out of normal law into direct law. And once it was in direct law, it no longer automatically trimmed the aircraft. This meant that the horizontal stabilizer remained at its last position, which was very nose up. From this point, the only way the pilots would be able to recover was if they had recognized that they needed to trim the aircraft manually. Whether they would have done this if they'd carried out the test at the recommended altitude of above 14,000 feet is impossible to know. But how did the aircraft even know it was stalling if its information comes from the angle of attack sensors, which were giving faulty data telling it that it was nowhere near a stall? Well, the stall warning only requires one of the angle of attack sensors to approach a stall angle in order to be triggered. So even if, as in this case, the data from the third angle of attack sensor had been voted out by the other two when it came to the flight control laws, any sensor which detected a stall angle would be enough to trigger the stall warning. This was perhaps the one part of the cascade of problems on this day that didn't have an unintended negative consequence. But it still wasn't enough. As a result of this crash, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency began to formally control non-revenue flights like this, requiring operators to define in advance which tests may be performed, at what altitude, and using what procedures, instead of allowing crews to improvise flight test style maneuvers on routine acceptance flights. Second, maintenance rules were tightened around critical sensors. Angle of attack probes were explicitly identified as requiring protection during washing and repainting, closing the loophole that allowed water ingestion during this work. And finally, stall training guidance was revised to reflect the reality of fly-by-wire aircraft. Pilots are now more carefully trained to look out for when flight control protections disappear, requiring manual trim and thrust reduction. The crash of Flight 888 Tango is a lesson in how what may seem like small deviations from defined procedures can have deadly consequences. As flying continues to get safer, these small instances of complacency will become an increasingly insidious threat, one that requires constant vigilance to control.